When T.S. Eliot turned to Christianity in the late 1920s, he turned to the Anglican understanding of Christianity. And to be more specific, he turned to the Catholic understanding of Anglican Christianity, very similar in many ways to C.S. Lewis, who was coming to Christianity at much the same time. C.S. Lewis was very much, again, Catholic Anglican, and even though their understanding of Catholic Anglicanism at the time differed, in minor ways, they gradually came to see that they were on the same page in their journey. Now, in Eliot's turn to Catholic Anglicanism, three elements emerged clearly. We see one element of that in section 1 of Ash Wednesday, in which the confessional was very important. So in part 1 of Ash Wednesday, Eliot uses the I 17 times, and significant elements of Catholic thought, whether Roman Catholic, Orthodox, or Catholic Anglicanism, is this important of confessing the interior attitudes that are often swirling about in the imagination of the mind, and having someone we go to regularly to confess what is going on internally. A second element of that was Eliot's turn to Dante, and not only the Divine Comedy, but also an earlier work, La Vita Nuova, in which Dante had a great commitment to Beatrice, and Beatrice, in fact, being the pointer to Mary, and the gap between our longing for the infinite and yet our imperfections in living consistently and meaningfully in the very longings that we move towards. And so this gap between the idealized end towards which we move and yet the reality in which we live. The third element is the important aspect of Mary, and for Dante, Beatrice. And so these three aspects for Eliot when we do Ash Wednesday are very important to understand when we light down on part 2 of Ash Wednesday. So let me start, and I will again do a reflective commentary on various elements of part 2 of Ash Wednesday. He starts with Lady. So he's addressing actually Beatrice. So we're in the confessional mode at this point. 3 white leopards sat under a juniper tree. So when we read that, we think, what are we talking about? 3 white leopards sat under the juniper tree. Well, we're right now in Dante's Divine Comedy, Canto 1, in which Dante begins his midlife journey, somewhat confused. He's lived his pilgrimage so far, but he's reached a point where there's a certain degree of dissatisfaction. People can, in their journey in life, on the one hand, make decisions throughout their 20s, 30s, and they begin to look back and reflect on what was the purpose of those decisions, and where am I going, and were they the best decisions, and what are alternates as I move into the futures. Others can be very successful at one level, but they enter into a deep, dark wood in which their soul is not at rest, it's not settled. And so Dante begins this journey in the Inferno in Canto 1. It's really just the first couple of verses in which he realizes his quest for the greater things, the more important things, he has betrayed, he has denied, he has sacrificed, and hence restless in the journey. And he has his eyes set on the New Jerusalem. But the danger, of course, and Dante was aware of this, we don't just automatically are transformed into the new, the purified, the deified self because we wish to be. There, in fact, is a journey ahead of us, and we have to face those shadows, those darker places in ourselves. And what Dante engages is the leopard, engages the lion and the she-wolf. And it is that element of us, if we don't deal with it, that can devour us. And so he's confessing to Lady, Beatrice. 3 white leopards sat under a juniper tree in the cool of the day. Having fed to satiety on my legs. Why my legs? The legs are that part of us that take us to places either of meaning, of purpose, or we can go to places in our journey which betray who we're meant to be. Much hinges on where our legs take us. On my legs, my heart is that place of my affections, my longings, my hunger for purpose of meaning. And if the heart is not properly ordered, it can lead to much pain and disorientation within the soul. And the leopards are eating that part of Eliot's and Dante's, in that sense, soul. My liver, one would think, what's that got to do literally with liver? Well, of course, the liver in medieval thought, of which Dante emerges and Eliot draws some very clearly, is once again that place of discernment, that place of insight. But if that goes askew, if that is not heeded and heard well, the soul is consumed by the leopards, because the leopards are always that element within us which will eat us and prevent us from becoming what we're meant to be. And that which had been contained in the hollow round of my skull, which is the intellect. And so what we have here, these white leopards, just as Dante's journey confronted them, so Eliot is drawing from Dante in the first canto of the Divine Comedy. He's going right to the place of the inferno, the burning within, the unresolved issues within, those places within the human soul which haven't been dealt with, but have to be burned in that sense. And when poor decisions are made, our legs, our heart, our liver, and our intellectual life fails to turn meaningfully to the true good, the better, the best, the noble in that sense. And so what Eliot is getting at here is that what you have, and he's confessing again to Our Lady, the decisions made have taken me to places which reflect back to part 1 of Ash Wednesday, in which I am ceasing to be what I could be, and I'm in the inferno of my inner life. And how do I move from the inferno to the purgatorio to the paradiso? What follows after that is, and God said, shall these bones live? So in the midst of the dark night, the cloud of unknowing, is there any life yet left by which the divine image of God is still there, or is it pretty well dissembled, in which there is no hope for the future? And God said, shall these bones live? And of course, at this point, he's drawing from Ezekiel. So Eliot in this part moves from Dante, the Divine Comedy, to Ezekiel. And shall these bones live? Shall these bones live? So the question is being asked, is it possible when we've gone to depths of darkness, depression, despair, what we sense that God is absent, God is silent, can we in any way rebuild, see those bones come to life again? What remains of them versus what has to be burned, what has to be destroyed, what has to be left behind in the purgatorio live? So shall these bones live? And shall these bones live, God asks. He's asking, but it's not, the answer is not there. So where does the answer come from in terms of the soul being reassembled again? And he says, and that which had been contained in the bones, which were already dry. So there's dryness. Once again, there's a sense of anew emptiness in this desert. Important to understand this whole Section 2 begins with the desert motif, in which all seems lost. There is no life. There is no fertility. There is no meaning. In fact, it's the dry sand, and the soul is very, very much a part of that dryness. There's no water to nourish or slake the hunger and the thirst. And that which had been contained in the bones, which were already died, said chirping, because of the goodness of this lady. So interesting enough, what you have Eliot, as a Catholic Anglican, as a Catholic in many ways, turns to the lady, which is Beatrice. And grace is mediated to Eliot in this story, as many on the journey itself, through those who have gone before us, and in this case, Beatrice, the lady of grace, the one who embodies eternity and mediates eternity to time. There's a form of Protestantism in which only the Spirit or Christ mediates grace to us, but within this Catholic tradition, grace is mediated from a variety of ways, and in this particular version in Section 2, it's Beatrice who embodies the fullness of Mary, and because of her loveliness, and because she honors the Virgin. So here you have this linking of Beatrice and Mary in meditation. So we looked at in the previous section, part 1, the meditative, and to teach us to sit still. So here the meditative side comes in once again, of which Eliot is going to articulate. It's because she, Beatrice, and the Virgin know what it means to sit still, to meditate, to be open to God, mediating grace through them to humanity, or what we'd say in the creeds, the communion of the saints, or the great cloud of witnesses in Hebrews. She honors the Virgin in meditation. We shine with brightness. So it's because of others who have lived with immense integrity, they impart that grace to us. And we shine, in fact, with divine brightness in light. And I who am here dissembled. So he turns again to the I, the confessional. His desires are pulled in a variety of directions. Who is the real I with multiple desires colliding within? He's dissembled. He's pulled apart, almost like, in one sense, the Horcruxes in Harry Potter and Voldemort. But I proffer my deeds to oblivion. So what does remain? I proffer my deeds to oblivion, and my love to the posterity of the desert. So much of who he thought he was is dissipating, it's disappearing, it's dissembled. But what remains, the best of him, that is the grace given to him, from Beatrice and Mary, I give that to the posterity of the desert and the fruit of the gourd. It is this which recovers my guts, the strings of my eyes, and the indigestible portions which the leopards reject. So the destructive nature of the leopards within, as it were, the shadow within, the dark part, at a certain point it cannot touch the divine image and likeness within, which is eternal. It can't eat that, it can't consume that. So Eliot is taking us to greater depths within us, which is indestructible in that sense. The leopards themselves reject because it very, very much is something that makes them sick and this ill. So too much goodness, particularly the great grace of goodness, even the leopards cannot consume. It destroys them. The lady is withdrawn in white gown to contemplation in white gown. Let the whiteness of bones atone to forgetfulness. Now, important, this section starts with white, the whiteness of the leopards. Whiteness is a symbol often of integrity, of authenticity. But authenticity and integrity can be betrayed. The good can often be distorted. There are often counterfeits of the good. So here you can have darkness and evil can clothe itself in white, just as the leopards have. But then there's the authentic white of the lady. And so she's withdrawn in her white gown to contemplation. And it's from contemplation the pure white light of eternity shines through. She's in a white gown. Reminds you very, very much of Galadriel in Lord of the Rings. And that the whiteness of the bones atone to forgetfulness. And so those things we must forget. We must leave behind. We must not return to forgetfulness. There is no life in them. So don't turn again to that which we know is the leopards will consume, or as it were, the internal leopards will consume. I have forgotten and would be forgotten. So I would forget, thus devoted, concentrated in purpose. And God said, prophesy to the wind, and to the wind only, for the wind will listen. So these two sources of grace, both Our Lady, who mediates grace, and the Spirit, of course, which you'll get in the book of John, of the wind. And so these two sources come to the Eliot, the writer, who is about to be transformed, about to become a new being, but much has to be left behind as he is in the inferno. And as he moves from the inferno through the various stages and ladders to the purgatorio, the wind will be the guide, the Spirit will be the guide, and the lady will be the guide, and Mary will be also. And the bones sang chirping, so there still is life, even in the midst, as I have mentioned earlier, the most painful, difficult, the deepest depression. Can we go to these places where seems to be the dry bones? They still do have marrow in them. There is still life in the image and likeness. And the bones sang chirping with the burden of the grasshopper saying, and this is where we get into the tightrope of which two what seem to be contradictory elements live together. And it's the Lady of Silence who offers to these as gifts, and beware of falling off one side of the tightrope and the other side of the tightrope, and lesser people tend to do this. So Lady of Silences, of course, the Lady of Silences then calls us to that silence and quiet place in our place where we have to hear much deeper. Calm and distressed. We all long for calmness, and yet we often all live in distress, in struggling with integrity and how we live our lives in a more meaningful way. So how do we live with distress and calm at the same time? No easy balance to walk on the tightrope of life, torn and most whole. How do we remain whole and yet understand tornness at the same time. Yet another tightrope tension talk. This is why, for example, Rowan Williams, one of the most significant theologians of the 20th century, his great guide and mentor is T.S. Eliot, and the four quartets are very important to Rowan Williams. And it's largely through Eliot we get the best of Rowan Williams' finest theology and philosophy. It was literature that brought Williams to theology, and Eliot was one of the key mentors for Rowan Williams. And so here you very much have in Rowan Williams the updated version of T.S. Eliot and his perennial significance. Number 3, rows of memory, but rows of forgetfulness. So how do we live in the tensions between the deepest memory, which can shape and reform, yet how do we live with forgetfulness, and particularly those things we cannot forget, which are difficult to forget in terms of deeds done, thought, word, and deed. Attention, significantly also to understand the rose is Christ in the Christian tradition. Any of the great cathedrals in Europe, you'll have the rose, and the rose is Christ, the rose of Sharon, the lily of the valley, the bright and the morning star. So the rose is very significant in this because it is the incarnate Christ. As the petals open and we come to see Christ fuller and fuller, as these petals unfold, we get to the core and the scent and the fragrance of eternity itself. So rows of memory, rows of forgetfulness, exhausted yet life-giving. How do we live in that particular tension between weariness and life-giving? Worried, reposeful at the same time. The Spirit, the single rose, which is Christ, is now the garden. So we're moving now from the desert, often of human experience, where dryness, depression, dark nights exist, but there's also the garden of which the rose or Christ has come to bring back to life again, and all the immense flowers of eternity begin to bloom, where all loves end. Now this is where Eliot will constantly return to the notion of the end, or the telos, not ending as the ending of something, but the very fulfillment and the purpose of something, and then looking back from the telos of the end to where is all this momentum, where is all this transformation, where is it pointing to in all this purification. So it's now the garden where all loves end, or all loves reach their fulfillment or their consummation. And so it's the point which we're moving towards in an ongoing way. It terminates torment of love unsatisfied, the greater torment, finally, of love satisfied, end of the endless, a journey to the end. So we get this notion of the end constantly in T.S. Eliot in part 2 of Ash Wednesday, as we move towards the very fulfillment, and just as the rose unfolds, one often sees as the rose emerges, the petals are closed in on one another, the light and the sun of eternity gradually opening up the petal bit by bit to the center. That's the end of the rose, as all the petals unfold in their fullness. Just as the end of the acorn is the oak tree, this is built within it is the very nature of what something can be as the unfolding through the inferno to the purgatory takes place. So journey to the end, conclusion of all that is inconclusible. And then we move into speech without word. There's a form of talking and of speech that lacks depth. It lacks word, as it were, in the small W word. And this is where we go back to the meditative, the contemplative. How do we hear the small W word within our soul, within our spirit, which alters then, and it's the wind also that we speak to that calls us forth. So speech without word. So many speak, but it doesn't have the depth of the life-giving word. And word, capital W, of no speech. So Eliot is taking us ever deeper in what it means to hear and what it means to be shaped by the divine logos, or the word in that sense. So speech without word, so people can talk a lot, even seem to be intellectually astute, but it lacks the living small w word and the word of no speech. And so he's calling people through the notion of the wind, through the rose, all these metaphors, and Our Lady itself. Grace to the Mother for the garden, where all love ends, or all love is fulfilled. So we move from the desert, which can be very, very painful, where things seem to be empty. You're essentially dealing with the Jewish story of the Exodus through the desert, where people have to leave anything behind. They seem to reach a point of emptiness. God is not with them. They seek to return to the Egypt of the false self. but all love ends as we move towards the garden. And then the last bit, we're back to the under the juniper tree where we began. Under the juniper tree, the bones sang, scattered and shining. So we're back in the reality often of the human journey, which can be desert, but it also can be longing for garden. And this tension between desert and garden, and living in that tension. We are glad to be scattered. We did little good to each other. And he talks about when people are not in touch with their inner core, we do little good to each other. We hurt ourselves, we hurt other people. But under a tree in the cool of the day with the blessing of sand. So even in the desert, the sand can bless us. Even in the most painful places, if we have ears to hear, if our soul is attentive and receptive, in fact, transformation can take place in the desert. We're not yet in the garden, but we're inching towards that. Forgetting themselves and each other, finally united. All these disparate desires are brought into a focused and directed attentiveness towards an end, which is essentially deification and transformation in the quiet of the desert. Often, if the desert is seen as a place of emptiness and deadness and no life, in fact, there's great life in the desert. And anyone who spent time in the desert, as I have and hiked many times, there's all sorts of plants grow in the desert just under the soil. And so in the desert of our own life, if we understand Our Lady and what she can bring, there can be life. And this is the land which ye shall divide by lot, and neither division nor unity matters. This is the land. So this is our inheritance. Our inheritance is not to live in any perpetual sense in the new garden where the rose dominates. We live in the desert. This is our inheritance. But within the desert, there is hope. And we also move ever so meaningfully toward the garden which is provided for us, which is the new Eden and the new Jerusalem. And so ends, in that sense, section 2 of Ash Wednesday. When we move into section 3, Eliot then moves into the Carmelite mystics of John of the Cross, Teresa, which then refer back to the patristic thinkers in terms of the ascent to truth. So just as you have in Dante the Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, so you have in the mothers and fathers of the church the ascent to truth, which we'll look at briefly, also touching on Gregory of Nyssa and many other fathers of the patristic era, East and West.